Hello. It's good to see you. Today we're going to be reading some more children's stories. We are going to read Snow White, Puss in Boots, and Beauty and the Beast. So these are the three we're going to read today. We're going to start with Snow White, which is by the Brothers Grimm. Long ago in wintertime, a queen sat by a window sewing. The snowflakes swirled down through the sky past the frame of the window, which was made of black ebony. Suddenly the queen pricked her finger with the needle, and 3 drops of blood fell upon the snow. The colors were so strong and beautiful that she thought at once, "If only I could have a child as white as snow, as red as blood, and as black as ebony." Soon afterward, the queen gave birth to a daughter who was white as snow, red as blood, and had hair as black as ebony. She was called Snow White, and when she was born, the queen died. After a year had passed, the king took another wife. She was very beautiful, but so proud that she could not bear to think that anyone might surpass her. She had a magical looking-glass, and day after day she stood before it and admired herself, saying, looking glass on the wall, who in the land is fairest of all?" And the glass answered, "Thou, O queen, art fairest in the land." Then the queen was happy, for she knew that the looking-glass spoke the truth. But Snow White was growing up, and each day she became more beautiful. And when she was 7 years old, she was as beautiful as the morning, and far more beautiful than the queen. Then the woman stood before her looking-glass and said, looking glass on the wall, who in the land is fairest of all?" It answered, "Thou, queen, may fair and lovely be, but Snow White is fairer still than thee." The queen was horrified. She whirled around and left the room, and her heart was filled with envy. From that day, whenever she looked at Snow White, the queen hated her. At last she could neither eat nor sleep, so consumed was she with hatred for the girl. Then she called to her side a huntsman and said to him, "Take the child into the darkest part of the forest. I can no longer bear the sight of her. Kill her and bring me back her lung and liver, so I will know that she is dead." The huntsman obeyed and took Snow White away. But when he had drawn his knife and was about to pierce her heart, she began to weep. "Please, huntsman, spare my life. I will run away into the forest and never return again." And she was so innocent and beautiful that the huntsman took pity upon her. "Run away then, child. I will not hurt you," he said. He thought the wild animals would soon kill her, and yet he felt as if a stone had been rolled from his heart because he would not be the one to do it. Just then a young boar came running by, so he stabbed it and cut out its lung and liver and took them to the queen. The cook had to prepare them for supper, and the queen ate them, certain now that Snow White had been killed. But now the child was all alone in the forest, with the great dark trees arching above her. She was terrified and began to run. She ran over rocks and through brambles, and the wild animals saw her but did her no harm. She ran as long as she could and as far as she could, and at evening she saw in the distance a little cottage with sparkling windows and a red-tiled roof. She was tired, and so she went there to rest. Inside, everything was small, but neat and clean and pretty. A table with a white cloth had been laid for supper, and Snow White saw 7 plates and 7 spoons and 7 cups. Against the wall stood 7 little beds side by side. She was so hungry and thirsty that she ate some vegetables and bread from each plate and drank a drop of wine from each cup. Then, as she was weary, she lay down upon each bed to find a comfortable one, and the seventh bed was just right. She pulled up the white coverlet and soon fell asleep. When it was dark, the owners of the cottage returned. They were 7 dwarfs who mined for copper and gold deep in the mountains. They lit their 7 candles and saw that someone had eaten their food and drunk their wine and laid upon their beds. And when the 7th dwarf came to his bed, he saw Snow White sleeping there. He called to the others, and they gathered around and held up their candles so that the light fell upon her face. "Oh, what a lovely child," they said. Then they did not wake her, but let her sleep undisturbed. The 7th dwarf stayed with the others, 1 hour in each bed, until the night was gone. At dawn, Snow White awoke. She was frightened when she saw the 7 dwarfs, but they treated her gently and asked her name and how she had come to be there. "My name is Snow White," she said, and she told them everything. The dwarfs felt very sorry for the girl who had come so near to death, and they agreed that she should stay in the cottage. "If you will take care of our house and have our suppers ready at night, you shall want for nothing," they told her. Snow White was happy then and said she would do all that they asked. Each morning they went off to their work in the mountains, and each evening when they came home, the supper was hot and the house was sparkling. But the dwarfs warned Snow White that she would be alone all day and must let no one in. "Beware of your stepmother," they said. "She will soon know you are here, and then she will come after you." Although the queen believed Snow White was dead, it was not long before she went again to her looking-glass and said, looking glass on the wall, who in this land is fairest of all?" And the looking-glass answered, "Over the hills where the 7 dwarfs dwell, Snow White is there, alive and well, and none is so fair as she." Then the queen knew that the huntsman had betrayed her, and Snow White was still alive. Her envy sprang up again, stronger than the first time, and so she determined to kill the girl herself. She thought and thought about how to do it, and then she painted her face and dressed herself as a peddler woman. No one would have known her as she set off through the woods, hobbling on a stick. When at last she came to the dwarf's house, she knocked upon the door. "Pretty wares to sell, pretty wares to sell," she cried. Snow White looked out the window and saw that it was only an old peddler woman who was holding up a bundle of apron ties woven in bright silks. "Surely I can let her in," thought the girl, and she unbolted the door and bought the pretty ties. "Don't you see, child? You must lace yourself more tightly," said the old woman. Snow White suspected nothing, but stood before her and let herself be laced with the new ties. But the old woman laced her so tightly that she lost her breath and fell down as if she were dead. Not long afterward, the 7 dwarfs returned. They were frightened when they found Snow White pale and motionless upon the floor. But as soon as they lifted her up, they saw that she was laced too tightly, and they cut the ties with a knife. Then the girl began to breathe again and soon recovered. When she told them what had happened, they said, "But the old peddler woman was the wicked queen, who would do anything to be rid of you. Be sure to take care and let no one in." As soon as the queen reached home, she went to her glass and said, looking glass on the wall, who in this land is fairest of all?" And it answered as before, "Over the hills where the 7 dwarfs dwell, Snow White is there, alive and well, and none is so fair as she." When she heard this, the queen was struck with fear, for she knew that Snow White had not been killed. The queen had some knowledge of witchcraft and decided to make a poison comb. She hid it with several others and then disguised herself, taking the shape of a different old woman. She set off across the 7 hills to the house of the 7 dwarfs, and knocked upon the door. "Good things to sell, good things to sell," she cried. Snow White looked out the window and said, "Go away, please. I dare not let anyone in." "But you must only look," said the old woman, and she held out the poisoned comb for Snow White to see. It was such a pretty comb, so delicate and fine, that the girl let herself be persuaded to open the door. "Now, child, I shall comb your hair properly," said the old woman, and she ran the comb through Snow White's ebony hair. At once the poison took effect, and Snow White swooned to the floor. "That will be an end to you," said the woman, and she went away. But it was nearly evening, and soon the dwarfs came home. When they saw Snow White lying as if she were dead, they suspected the queen and searched until they found the poisoned comb. Scarcely had they taken it from her head when Snow White awoke and told them what had happened. Then they warned her once again to take care and to open the door to no one. The queen at home went to her looking-glass and said, looking glass on the wall, who in this land is fairest of all?" Then it answered again, "Over the hills where the 7 dwarfs dwell, Snow White is there alive and well, and none is so fair as she." When the queen heard the glass say this, she trembled and shook with rage. "Snow White must die," she cried, "even if it costs me my life." She went into a secret room high at the top of the palace where no one ever came, and there she made a poisonous apple. The shape was perfect, and the outside shone red and white. It was so tempting that anyone who saw it must long for it, but whoever ate a piece would surely die. The queen dressed herself as a peasant's wife and painted her face. Then she went over the 7 hills to the 7 dwarfs' house and knocked upon the door. At once Snow White looked out the window and said, "I dare not let anyone in. The 7 dwarfs have told me not to." "I shall stay outside then," said the peasant woman. "Only taste one of my apples. They are so fresh and sweet." "No, I dare not take it," said Snow White. "What? Are you afraid of poison, you silly child? See, I will cut the apple in 2. You shall have the red part, and I will take the white." The apple was so cleverly made that only the red part was poisoned, but when Snow White saw that the peasant woman was unharmed, she could resist no longer, and she held out her hand for the fruit. The moment she bit into it, she fell dead upon the ground. The apple's poison had done its work. "White as snow, red as blood, black as ebony," the queen cried. "This time nothing can save you." When she went home, she said to her looking-glass, looking glass on the wall, who in the land is fairest of all?" It answered, "Thou, O queen, art fairest in the land." At last her envious heart was glad. In the evening the dwarfs found Snow White lying on the ground. She did not breathe or move, and though they undid her apron ties and washed her face with wine and water, it was no use. The child was dead. So they laid her upon a bier, and all 7 watched and mourned her for 3 days' time. They were going to bury her, but her black hair shone, and her cheeks were red and pretty as if she were still alive. "We cannot hide her in the dark ground," they said, so they had a coffin made for her of transparent glass. They laid Snow White in it, and in golden letters they wrote her name and that she was the daughter of a king. Then they put the coffin out upon the hill and took turns watching it, one at a time. And the birds came too and mourned Snow White, first an owl, then a raven, and at last a dove. Snow White lay for a long, long time in the coffin, and she did not change, but looked as if she were only sleeping, for she was even now white as snow, red as blood, and black as ebony. When it happened that a king's son came into the forest and saw the coffin upon the hill, then it happened. He knelt down before the beautiful Snow White and read the golden letters. Then he went to the dwarfs and said to them, "Give me the coffin, for I cannot live without Snow White. I will care for her coffin and keep her always as my own." The dwarfs would take no gold, but when they saw that the king's son was suffering for his love of the girl, they had pity upon him and allowed his servants to carry the coffin off. As they were traveling through the forest, the servants stumbled over a tree stump. All at once, the poisonous bit of apple that Snow White had eaten came up from her throat. A few moments later, she opened her eyes and was once more alive. "Where am I?" she asked, looking about her. "You are with me," said the king's son, and he told her how it had come to pass. "Please stay with me, and we shall be married. I love you more than anything on earth." Snow White agreed and went with him to his father's palace. All the people from the king's land and the lands that bordered upon it were invited to the wedding feast, and among these was Snow White's stepmother. When she had dressed herself in her most splendid gown, she went before the looking-glass and said, looking glass on the wall, who in the land is fairest of all?" And the glass answered, "Thou, queen, art the fairest here I've seen, but fairer still is the new-made queen." When she heard this, the queen uttered a curse, but her envy and curiosity were so great that she went to the wedding feast to see her rival. And when she saw that it was Snow White, she stood rigid with rage and terror. But iron slippers had been heated in the fire, and now they were brought to the queen with tongs and set upon the stone floor. She was forced to wear the red-hot shoes and danced until she fell down dead. Wow. The end. Now the next story is Puss in Boots from Charles Perrault. I may be pronouncing that wrong. There's a cat. Far out in the countryside, there was a poor miller who died, leaving his 3 sons all that he owned. No lawyers were called in, as they would have taken everything. Isn't that the truth? Instead, the sons divided the property among themselves. The eldest took the mill, the second the donkey, and the third was left with the miller's cat. The youngest son was unhappy at having so poor a share. "My brothers can join together and earn a living," said he, "but once I have eaten my cat and made a muff from his skin, I will surely die of hunger." The cat had been eavesdropping, and now he decided to speak. "Do not fret, master," he said in a respectful and serious tone. "Only give me a stout sack and a pair of boots to protect my feet from the brambles, and you will find you have received the best portion of your father's estate." Though the youth had little trust in the words of a cat, he had seen the creature play many clever tricks to snare rats and mice, so he decided to give him what he asked. The cat put on the boots and slung the sack around his neck. Then he went to a place he knew of where many rabbits came to eat. He put a quantity of bran and some thistle leaves into his sack and stretched it out near it as if he were a corpse. Soon a foolish young rabbit jumped into the sack, and the cat pulled the drawstrings tight and killed him without mercy. Proudly the cat took his prey to the palace and asked to speak with the king. He had decided that his master was to be called the Marquis of Carabas, and when he was brought into the king's apartment, he bowed low, saying, "Look, sire, I have a rabbit that my noble lord, the Marquis of Carabas, has commanded me to present to you." "Thank your master for me," said the king, "and tell him I am well pleased with his gift." Another time the cat carried his sack and hid himself among some standing corn. When a brace of partridges ran into the sack, he drew the strings and so caught them both. Again he presented his prey to the king, and again the king thanked him. For 2 or 3 months the cat continued to bring his master's game to the king. One day, when he knew the king would be out along the riverside with his beautiful daughter, the cat said to his master, "If you will but follow my advice, your fortune shall be made. You must bathe in the river at a place I show you, and then leave the rest to me." The Marquis of Carabas went off to bathe without ever knowing why the cat wanted him to. But no sooner had he jumped into the water than the king passed by, and the cat cried out loudly, "Help, help, my lord! The Marquis of Carabas is drowning!" At this commotion, the king looked out the window of his coach and recognized the cat who had so often brought him game. Quickly he commanded his guards to save his lordship, the Marquis of Carabas. While they were drawing the Marquis from the river, the cat came up to the coach and told the king his master's clothes had been stolen by some thieves who had run off with them. But the cunning cat had hidden the clothing under a large stone. Quickly the king commanded a servant to hurry to the palace and fetch one of his own suits for the Marquis of Carabas. When he was dressed, he looked fine and handsome, and the king's daughter thought she liked him very much. Without the need of any instruction from his cat, the Marquis of Carabas treated her with affection and tenderness, and soon she was quite in love with him. The king invited the Marquis of Carabas to join them in their coach. The cat ran on before them, overjoyed that his scheme had begun to succeed. Coming upon some mowers who were scything a meadow, he said, "Good people, you must tell the king that the meadow you mow belongs to the Marquis of Carabas, or you shall be chopped into tiny pieces like herbs for the pot." Then the king stopped his coach by the meadow and asked the mowers who owned it. "The Marquis of Carabas," they answered all together, for the cat's threat had made them afraid. "You have a fine estate there," said the king to the Marquis of Carabas. "Yes, sire," said the Marquis quickly, "and it yields a plentiful harvest each year." The cat, who went on before them, soon met some reapers. "Good people," he said, "if you do not say that the corn you are reaping belongs to the Marquis of Carabas, you shall be chopped as small as herbs for the pot." The king, when he passed, asked the reapers who owned all the corn. "The Marquis of Carabas," they answered at once. The cat gave the same warning to all he met, and the king and his daughter were astonished at the vast estates of the Marquis of Carabas. At last the cat came to a great castle that was commanded by an ogre, the richest ever known. All the lands that the king had passed through were part of the ogre's holdings. The cat had taken care to learn everything he could about the ogre, and now asked to see him, saying he had come to pay his respects. The ogre received him as politely as an ogre could and made him sit down. "I have been told," said the cat, "that you are able to change yourself into all sorts of creatures, that you can, for example, transform yourself into a lion." "That is so," said the ogre roughly, "and just to convince you, I shall now become a lion." When he saw a huge lion so near, the cat became terrified and jumped up on the roof. His boots skidded and slipped upon the tiles, and he nearly fell to his death. But when the ogre became only an ogre once more, the cat came down and confessed to his fear. "I have also been told," he said to the ogre, "that you can take the shape of tiny creatures, that you can, for example, transform yourself into a rat or even a mouse. But I must tell you, I find this hard to believe." "Hard to believe? You will soon see," cried the ogre, and he changed himself into a mouse and began to scamper about on the floor. The cat lost no time, but fell upon him and ate him in one bite. And now the king arrived at the ogre's castle and decided to stop there. The cat, who heard the coach pass over the drawbridge, ran outside and said to the king, "Welcome, your majesty, to the castle of the Marquis of Carabas." "What? And does this castle too belong to you, my lord Marquis?" said the king. "Come, let us go inside." Without a word, the Marquis gave his hand to the young princess, and they followed the king. First they came into a great hall where they found a splendid banquet the ogre had prepared for some friends. But the friends had seen the king's coach outside and so had not dared to enter. Impressed by the vast wealth of the Marquis of Carabas and realizing his daughter was in love with him, the king said at last, "You will have only yourself to blame, my lord Marquis, if you are not soon my son-in-law." The Marquis bowed very low and accepted the honor the king had conferred upon him. That very same day he married the princess. The cat became a great lord and never again ran after mice except for the fun of it. The end. The last story we have is Beauty and the Beast from Madame Le Prince de Beaumont. A rich merchant in a far-off land had for many years been lucky in all his undertakings. His 3 daughters danced in jeweled ball gowns, and his 3 sons rode Arabian steeds that moved like the wind. Then one day, for no reason, the merchant suddenly lost everything. His house caught fire and burned to the ground, and all his ships at sea were sunk or plundered by pirates. Only a small country cottage remained to him, and the merchant was forced to move there with his children. The 2 older daughters grumbled continually, regretting the lost amusements of their past. But the youngest, who was called Beauty, tried her best to comfort her father and brothers. After many months, the merchant got news that one of his ships, which he believed was lost, had come safely into port. His children came to see him off on his journey to the harbor town, naming the presents he must buy them, but Beauty did not ask for anything. When her father pressed her, she said she only wished for his safe return. "But surely, Beauty, there is some small treasure I may bring you," he said. "If you see a rose along the way, you might pick it for me," she answered. "It is my favorite flower, and it does not grow near here." Then the merchant set out and reached the town. He soon discovered that his companions, believing him dead, had divided all the goods between them. Thus he was forced to return home, poorer even than when he had started. The way led through a deep forest, and it was snowing so bitterly that his horse could hardly carry him farther. Just when the merchant was about to give up hope, he saw a track that opened into an avenue lined with orange trees. To his surprise, no snow had fallen there, and the air smelled sweet and warm. Soon the merchant came to a courtyard, and then he went inside a vast castle. He passed through many splendid rooms, but no one answered when he called out. The place seemed entirely empty, and a deep silence was everywhere. At last he saw a small sitting room where a cheerful fire was blazing. A table was set with all manner of wines and meats, and as the merchant was very hungry, he lost no time in beginning the meal. Afterward he looked again for his host to thank him, but, finding no one, he lay down upon a couch before the fire and fell fast asleep. When he awoke, he was refreshed and ready to continue his journey. Just as he was passing out of the courtyard, he saw a hedge of roses. Remembering Beauty's request, he stopped and gathered one to bring to her. But no sooner had he done so than a hideous beast appeared. His face was so ugly that the man could not bear to look at it. The beast spoke in a terrible voice. "So this, then, is how you show your gratitude? Was it not enough that I allowed you in my castle and was kind to you?" The merchant fell to his knees. "Oh, please, noble beast, do not take my life. I only picked the rose for my daughter Beauty, who begged me to get her one." On hearing this, the beast said gruffly, "I will forgive you only if you send one of your daughters to die in your stead. She must come willingly, or else I will not have her. Now you may stay and rest in my castle until tomorrow." Although the merchant found an excellent supper laid for him, he could not eat, nor could he sleep, although everything had been provided for his comfort. The next morning he set out again on a fine horse that the Beast had left him. When he came near his house, the children came out to greet him, but seeing the sadness in his face and his eyes filled with tears, they asked what was the matter. He gave Beauty the rose and told her what had happened. At once the two older sisters turned on Beauty. "It is your fault," they told her. "A rose indeed." "I shall go with father," Beauty said. "We will keep his promise to the Beast." Her father and brothers, who loved her, begged Beauty to change her mind, but nothing would sway her. Go she must, and so they set out the very next morning, riding together on the Beast's horse. When they reached the avenue of orange trees, the statues were holding flaming torches and fireworks flared in the sky. The palace gates opened of themselves, and Beauty and her father walked into a room where a delicious meal awaited them. Hardly had they finished eating when they heard the Beast's footsteps echoing on the marble floor. Beauty clung to her father in terror, but the Beast spoke to them in a mild tone and inquired about their journey. "Have you come here willingly, Beauty, to die in place of your father?" he said at last. "Yes, willingly, and I know that I must stay," she said, looking at his face and trying to keep her voice from trembling. "That is good," the Beast answered. "Your father may spend the night, but must go home in the morning." He bowed and took his leave of them. Beauty tried to comfort her father when they parted by saying that the Beast did not seem very cruel. Perhaps he would relent and one day allow her to return home. She watched him ride off and then walked up a curving stairway into a room with mirrors all around. On the door was written in golden letters, "Beauty's room," and in the mornings a clock awakened her by calling her name softly 12 times. She was alone all day, but when she was having her supper, the Beast would draw the curtains and come in. He spoke to her so pleasantly that she soon lost much of her fear of him. Each night, just before he left, he turned toward her and said, "Am I very ugly?" "Yes," replied Beauty, "but you are so kind to me that I no longer mind." "Will you marry me then?" he asked. "Pray do not ask me," said Beauty. "Since you will not, then good night, Beauty," and the Beast would go away. The castle was full of galleries and apartments containing rare and precious things. In one room was a cage filled with exotic birds. In another, a troop of monkeys of all sizes came to meet her, making low bows. Beauty was enchanted with them and asked the Beast if she might have one to keep her company. At once 2 young apes appeared and 2 small monkeys with them. They chattered and jumped all around her, making Beauty laugh. Each night at supper time, the Beast came to see her. Gradually she came to know him and like him more and more, but to his question, "Beauty, will you marry me?" she always said, "No, Beast," very gently. And when she said these words, it seemed to her that he was sad and in some way disappointed with her. Though Beauty had everything she could wish for and was content there, she never stopped missing her father and her brothers and sisters. At last one evening she begged the Beast to let her go home. "Ah, Beauty, will you desert an unhappy Beast so easily?" "Very well, then. You shall visit your home, but must promise to return in 2 months' time. You will not need any horse to carry you back. Only take this ring and turn it twice upon your finger the night before you come away, and in the morning you will be with me." The Beast told her to take all that she wanted from the castle as presents for her family, and he gave her 2 trunks. Though Beauty heaped them to the top with gold and trinkets, there always seemed to be more room, and they were not filled until she was tired of packing them. She went to sleep, but in the morning when she awoke, she was in a strange place. Suddenly she heard her father's voice and knew that she was home. Here's the ring. Her sisters and brothers greeted her joyfully, But though their fortunes had changed and they were living in the town again, their entertainment seemed hollow, and Beauty often thought of the castle where she had been so happy. As the weeks went by, she spoke of returning, but her father and brothers begged her to stay, and she had not the courage to say goodbye to them. The ring the Beast had given her was on her dressing stand, and one night Beauty put it on and gazed into the stone. Slowly an image appeared, and she saw the Beast in a far part of the castle gardens. He was lying on his back and seemed to be dying. In a panic, Beauty grasped the ring and turned it around 2 times. In the morning, she was at the Beast's castle. She searched everywhere but could not find him. At last she ran to the place in the garden she had dreamed of and came upon the Beast lying among the high bushes. Beauty put her head down on his chest, but at first he was not breathing. Then she began to weep. "Oh, he is dead, and it is on my account," she said, and her tears fell upon his face. Slowly the Beast opened his eyes. "Oh, Beast, how you frightened me!" Beauty cried. I never before knew how much I loved you." "Can you really care for such an ugly creature as I am?" said the Beast faintly. "Yes, oh yes, dear Beast. Only live to be my husband, and I will be your wife forever." The moment Beauty uttered these words, a dazzling light shone everywhere. The palace windows glittered with lamps, and music was heard all around. To Beauty's great wonder, a handsome prince stood before her. He said that her words had broken the spell of a magician who had doomed him to wear the form of a beast. This terrible enchantment could be broken only when a maiden loved him in spite of his ugliness. Then the grateful prince claimed Beauty as his bride. Her family was sent for, and the wedding was celebrated the very next day. The end. That is the end of Beauty and the Beast. And Puss in Boots and Snow White. I hope that you enjoyed the stories. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you again really soon.